I don't really know why I agreed to go to that cabin in the first place. Maybe it was the way it was pitched to me. A quiet weekend away, off-grid, just me and nature. No work emails, no buzzing phone, no traffic, no city noise. I'd been running on fumes for months, and the idea of silence sounded like medicine. I didn't realize how loud silence can get when you're the only one hearing it. The cabin was in northern Michigan, about a 4-hour drive from where I lived in Grand Rapids. A friend of a friend owned it. It wasn't one of those modern vacation rentals with a hot tub and satellite TV. This was a real off-the-grid spot. No power, no running water, no reception. They said it had a wood-burning stove, a well with a pump, and a small outhouse. That was it. The directions I was given were rough, the kind you scribble down on paper because GPS gives up halfway. Turn right at the unmarked fork after the third red mailbox, kind of thing. By the time I made the final turn onto a narrow dirt road surrounded by thick woods on both sides, I had to roll the window down to make sure I could even hear myself over the gravel under the tires. The road curved and wound deeper into the forest until I started to lose any sense of direction. It was mid-October, and the trees were all fire-colored. Reds, oranges, golds, a few stubborn greens still clinging on. The sun was dropping behind the trees when I finally pulled into the clearing. The cabin sat about 30 feet back from the end of the road. It looked old but solid, one-story, dark brown logs, pitched roof, a small front porch. A rusted axe leaned against a pile of chopped wood, and there was a dented metal bucket next to the well. Inside, it smelled like wood and something faintly musty. I walked through slowly, feeling like I was stepping into a museum. There was one small bedroom with a cot and a thin mattress, a little table with 2 chairs, a shelf with some old paperbacks, and a stove in the corner with a stack of wood next to it. I dropped my bag near the bed and lit a candle. The light flickered across the walls, casting long shadows that danced on the rough wooden boards. It was already cooling down outside, and I could feel the cold creeping in through the cracks, so I got the fire going early. It took longer than I thought to get a good burn going. I hadn't used a wood stove since I was a kid. By the time the fire was strong, I was sweating a little. The cabin warmed up slowly, and I sat near it for a while, listening to the crackling and letting my brain finally slow down. The first night wasn't bad. Quiet. Too quiet, maybe. I kept hearing little noises outside. Branches cracking, leaves rustling. And even though I told myself it was just animals or the wind, it still put me on edge. I didn't sleep that well. Every little sound made me open my eyes and listen hard. The next morning, I pumped water from the well into the bucket and used it to wash up a little and boil some coffee on the stove. Felt good, honestly. Primitive but clean in a weird way. The sun was out, so I decided to take a walk down the trail I'd seen behind the cabin. It led into the woods and wasn't marked, but it looked like it had been used before. I walked for about an hour, just breathing in the fresh air, feeling the earth under my boots. The trail got tighter the farther I went, the trees closing in, and at one point I came across an old hunting blind up in a tree. It looked abandoned. The ladder was half-rotted, and the whole thing swayed when the wind moved the branches. I stood there looking up at it for a while before heading back. When I returned, something felt off. I don't know how else to describe it. The cabin looked the same, but I had this crawling feeling in the back of my neck. I told myself I was being paranoid, just spooked from the walk in the dense woods, but the feeling didn't really go away. I checked the door. It was still locked the way I left it. I went inside, and nothing seemed touched. Still, I felt watched. That night, I had trouble sleeping again. The fire had died down and the temperature dropped hard. I kept waking up cold. At one point, around 3 a.m., I heard a thump outside. Not loud, but clear. A single, dull thump like something fell or was dropped. I sat up and held my breath, staring at the wall. The stove made its usual ticking as it cooled, but that thump had nothing to do with the stove. Came from outside, near the back. I didn't go out there. I stayed awake for another hour, listening. Nothing else happened. I must have dozed off eventually, because when I opened my eyes again, light was coming in through the gaps in the window shutters. I stepped out the front door, boots crunching over frosted leaves. I walked slowly around the cabin, looking at the ground. and I saw it, a shoe print, a single muddy print near the back window. It wasn't mine. It was too wide. I wear a size 10 and this had to be a 12, maybe bigger. The edges were still fresh and wet. Someone had been out there during the night. I stood there for a long time trying to process it. There was no reason anyone else should be out here. The nearest cabin or house was miles away. I hadn't passed a single car on the drive-in. My heart started pounding, and suddenly the silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like a trap. I went back inside and locked the door. I pushed the little table up against it too, even though I knew it wouldn't do much. I didn't have a gun, just a folding knife in my backpack. I kept it on me the rest of the day. I didn't leave the cabin. I just sat inside, listening. Every now and then I'd go to the window and peek through a gap in the shutter. Nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone. But the woods were thick, and someone could be out there watching and I wouldn't know it. The feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the fire going and sat in the chair with the knife in my hand, listening to the darkness press in around me. At around 1 a.m., I heard it again. A sound. Not a thump this time, more like a scrape. Long and slow along the back wall of the cabin. Then nothing. I didn't move. I just sat there, eyes wide, the sound echoing in my head. After about 10 minutes, I got up and went to the back window, careful not to make noise. I pulled the curtain just a sliver and looked out. Nothing. But then movement, just for a second. A shape. It passed between two trees, maybe 30 feet from the cabin. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark, then gone. I backed away from the window and sat back down. My hands were shaking. I didn't light another candle. I didn't want any light giving away where I was. The morning took forever to come. I barely moved until I saw the light coming in again. When it did, I packed. Fast. I stuffed everything into my bag. Didn't bother cleaning up. I didn't eat, didn't drink. I just threw my stuff in the truck, started it up, and turned around. As I was backing out of the clearing, I saw something in the rear view. A figure halfway behind a tree at the edge of the clearing. Just standing there, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I hit the gas and didn't look back again. The drive back felt like it took days. Every turn, every mile felt like it was dragging. I didn't relax until I saw the city limits again. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. What was I going to say? That I went to a cabin alone and someone was watching me in the woods? Weeks went by before I could sleep normally again. Even now, months later, I double-check the locks every night. I still hear things sometimes. Branches cracking, leaves moving, and my body tenses up like I'm back in that cabin. I don't know what that guy wanted. Maybe he was just messing with me. Maybe he was waiting for me to let my guard down. I'll never know. But I do know one thing. I'll never go back to that cabin. I won't go that deep into the woods again, alone or not. You can keep your silence. I'll take the noise. I rented the cabin on a Thursday. It was early fall, mid-September, and the leaves were just starting to change. The place was about 3.5 hours north of where I lived, tucked away in the edge of the Adirondacks, just far enough to feel isolated without being completely off the grid. I found it on a short-term rental site. The photos showed a plain wooden cabin, nothing fancy, just a little A-frame with a wood stove, a porch out front, and a clearing in the trees. It looked peaceful. That's all I wanted. A few days to myself to disconnect. No emails, no meetings, no traffic, no people. When I pulled up, the dirt road was narrower than I expected. The GPS had gotten it mostly right, but the last mile was unpaved, winding, and tight. The trees closed in around the car as I crept up the incline. The cabin finally came into view, sitting in a little dip in the terrain, with a slope rising behind it and trees all around. No cell service. That didn't surprise me. I downloaded some offline maps and packed a few books. Inside, the cabin smelled like cedar and dust. There was one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a bathroom with questionable plumbing. A little fireplace made of stone stood in the corner. I opened all the windows and let the fresh air in while I unpacked. I didn't bring much, just clothes, food, a flashlight, a hunting knife I always brought on hikes, and a couple notebooks. I had no real plans. I just wanted to think and relax. The first night was quiet. I made pasta, read until dark, and went to bed early. The bed creaked, but it was clean. I left the window cracked to let in the cool air. I remember falling asleep to the sound of wind rustling the trees. It was exactly what I needed. The next day, I hiked one of the nearby trails. The area was mostly state land, and there was a trailhead a short walk from the cabin. The trail looped through the woods and came back around to a fire road. I didn't see another person the whole time, just squirrels, a rabbit, and one deer that bolted before I could even raise my camera. When I got back, I made eggs and toast and sat on the porch, listening to the birds. That night, I built a fire and stared at it until the logs collapsed into glowing coals. It was the third night when I started noticing things. Nothing dramatic at first, just little details that felt off. I'd wake up in the morning and a cabinet would be open that I was sure I'd closed. Once, I found my flashlight sitting on the counter instead of in the drawer where I'd left it. Small things, the kind of stuff you can explain away. Maybe I was tired, maybe I moved it and forgot, but it kept happening. The next morning, one of the porch chairs was turned facing the woods. Not just moved an inch or two, but completely turned around. I hadn't touched it since I got there. I stared at it for a long time before moving it back. I told myself maybe the wind had shifted it somehow, but the chair was heavy, solid wood. It would take effort. That day, I checked all the doors and windows. Everything locked. I didn't see any signs of forced entry. No tracks outside, at least none I recognized. I brushed it off. Maybe I was being paranoid. Still, I couldn't relax after that. I kept the knife next to the bed. I started locking the bedroom door at night, even though I was alone. I didn't sleep as well. Every creak of the cabin made my ears perk up. I told myself it was just a different environment. I wasn't used to this kind of quiet. The next night, things got worse. I went to bed around 10. It was colder that night, and I closed the window. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a thump. Not a sharp noise, but a dull, solid thump like someone had dropped something heavy on the floor. I froze in bed. The sound had come from the main room, just outside the bedroom door. I didn't move for a long time. I just listened. My heart was pounding. The cabin was silent again. No footsteps, no talking, no creaking. I finally reached over and grabbed the knife. I eased out of bed and opened the door as quietly as I could. The main room was dark. I hadn't left any lights on. I stood in the doorway for a few minutes, waiting. My eyes adjusted. I didn't see anything at first. Then I noticed the front door. It was unlocked. I was absolutely sure I had locked it. I closed the distance quickly and checked the handle. Not just unlocked, but slightly open. Only by an inch or two, but enough to see that the latch hadn't caught. I shut it and threw the deadbolt. I stood there with my knife in hand, listening. Still nothing. I checked every corner of the cabin. Bathroom, closet, under the bed. Nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in a chair facing the front door, knife in my lap, ears straining for any sound. In the morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. I found something that made my stomach drop. Behind the cabin, near the slope, I found a clear footprint in the mud, bigger than mine. Heavy tread. A work boot, probably. It was pointed toward the cabin. No other prints around it. Just the one, as if someone had been standing there watching. I packed my things. I didn't care if I had 3 days left. I couldn't stay. I didn't feel safe. I loaded everything into the car, locked the cabin one last time, and started down the dirt road. I only got about a mile before I saw the truck. It was parked half on the road, half in the brush. Old Ford, faded blue, rust on the fenders. No plates, no one inside. It hadn't been there when I arrived 3 days earlier. I slowed down and stopped. I didn't want to drive past it without looking. I got out, knife in my pocket, and walked up to it. The driver's side window was rolled down. The seat was empty. There were fast food wrappers in the passenger seat. The air smelled like old sweat and cigarettes. The keys were gone. I looked around. The woods were quiet. No birds, no wind, just stillness. I got back in my car and drove past as fast as I could. When I hit the paved road, I didn't stop. I didn't even check the map. I drove straight home. Later that night, I filed a report with the rental site. Told them I thought someone had been entering the cabin. They apologized, said they'd investigate. I don't know if they ever did. I didn't follow up. I couldn't stop thinking about that footprint. The chair turned toward the woods. The unlocked door. The truck. About a week later, I got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. It showed the cabin, taken from the woods behind it. The porch lights were on. I was in the frame, sitting in the chair, reading a book. It had to have been taken the first or second night. I looked calm, relaxed, completely unaware. I went straight to the police, filed a report, gave them the photo. They didn't find anything. The address was remote, no security cameras on the road, nothing to trace. They asked if I had any enemies, if anyone knew I was there. I didn't. I hadn't told anyone about the trip. I'd wanted to be alone. The officer said maybe it was a squatter or a poacher, someone living off the land. Said sometimes they keep to themselves, but sometimes they don't. Said it was good I left when I did. I changed the locks on my house that same week. Bought a new phone, a new number. I started sleeping with a baseball bat by the bed. For weeks, every noise at night sent me jolting upright. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in the cabin with me, watching me, maybe even inside while I slept. I never went back. Not to that cabin. Not to that part of the state. I stopped going out to the woods altogether for a long time. I still love nature, but I keep my distance now. I book cabins with verified hosts. I check in with friends. I let people know where I'm going. I take it seriously, because it wasn't some ghost story. It wasn't a creature or a myth. It was just a person, a real person, and that's what scares me the most. Started as a solo getaway I'd been meaning to take for years. I kept putting it off, always some excuse. Work, life, money. But after a rough winter and a burnout that hit me harder than I expected, I finally pulled the trigger and booked a small off-grid cabin in northern Minnesota, not far from the Canadian border. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal, just a tiny one-room cabin with a wood stove, a twin bed, and a porch overlooking a private lake. I left on a Thursday morning. The drive up was long, 7 hours from Minneapolis, but I liked the silence, the slow change in scenery from city to forest, buildings fading into endless pines. My last stop before entering total wilderness was a general store in a town called Ely. I stocked up on supplies, canned food, firewood, a couple gallons of water, propane for the single-burner stove in the cabin, and some instant coffee. The guy at the counter looked like he'd lived up there his whole life. He gave me a long look when I told him where I was headed. "That's real far out," he said. "You got a radio?" I didn't. He raised an eyebrow but didn't press it. The road past Ely turned to gravel and then to dirt. The last 5 miles were more like a trail than a road. Just two wool ruts through the trees, lined with wet, dead leaves and mud from snowmelt. I had to take it slow, sometimes creeping along at less than 5 miles an hour. My tires slid more than once. It crossed my mind that I should have come in a truck instead of my old Subaru, but I made it eventually. The cabin was about 100 feet from the lake, tucked between tall pines and bare birch trees. It was exactly what I wanted: quiet, simple, remote. No other cabins in sight, just forest, lake, and sky. There was a tiny outhouse about 30 yards from the main building, and a hand pump well I was told might not work this early in the spring. The ground was still soft from the melt. Snow lingered in patches near the trees. Inside the cabin, everything was basic but clean. A twin bed with flannel sheets, a small table and chair, shelves with dishes and old books, and a wood stove that was clearly used often. A single-pane window looked out over the lake, and there was a small axe leaning against the wall by the door. No electricity, no plumbing, just oil lamps and matches, a couple flashlights, and candles in old jars. I unpacked and settled in. That first night was peaceful, cold, but the wood stove kept me warm. I sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket and watched the lake until it got too dark to see. No lights anywhere, just stars. So many of them it felt like I was floating in space. I went to bed early and slept hard. The second day was when things started to feel off. It wasn't anything big, just little things that stuck in my mind. I chopped some wood in the morning and left the axe by the stump. But when I came back from walking the edge of the lake, it was leaned against the cabin door. I told myself I was probably just forgetful. Maybe I leaned it there earlier and didn't remember, but it nagged at me. Later that afternoon, I took a short hike, just a mile or two into the woods behind the cabin. I had a compass and a basic topographic map, and I stayed close to familiar landmarks. Rocks, a bend in a creek, a downed tree that looked like it had been there a while. But on the way back, I got turned around. Not lost exactly. I could still hear the lake if I stopped and listened, but I ended up coming back to the cabin from a different angle. When I stepped out of the trees and saw the cabin from the side instead of the front, I had this weird moment of panic, like I wasn't sure it was even mine. I don't know how to explain it. Passed, but it stuck with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up, rattling the branches and the tin chimney. Every little sound outside felt louder, closer. I kept hearing something. Twigs snapping, footsteps maybe? But every time I opened the door and looked out, there was nothing. No animals, no people, just dark trees and still water. I kept telling myself it was deer, maybe a raccoon, but my stomach felt tight the whole night. I finally dozed off around 3 a.m., and when I woke up the next morning, there were boot prints in the soft earth by the porch steps. Not mine. Too wide, too deep. My boots are old, and the tread is worn. These were fresh, deep lug prints like work boots. They came from the woods and stopped right at the bottom step. Then nothing. No prints going back. Just gone. I stood there staring at them for a long time. Then I walked a slow circle around the cabin. Nothing else seemed touched. The axe was still there. The door was still locked. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had come right up to the cabin in the night and just watched. I should have left then. I know that now, but I told myself I was overreacting. I didn't want to give up my trip over some muddy prints. I stayed close to the cabin all that day. I didn't hike. I barely went near the trees, just stayed near the firewood pile, reading a book I couldn't focus on, checking the tree line every few minutes. Every time the wind moved the branches, I looked up. Every crack of wood or bird call made me freeze. I felt like something was watching me, not an animal, something worse. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the lantern lit. I sat in the chair facing the door, the axe on the floor beside me. The wind had died down, and it was dead quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no frogs, just stillness. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Not loud, careful, slow. They crunched through the leaves around the cabin, circling. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just gripped the axe and stared at the door. Then came the softest knock. Not even a knock, really, just a tap. One single tap near the bottom of the door, like someone testing it. Then silence. I sat there, muscles locked, for hours. The tap didn't come again. The footsteps faded eventually. I waited until dawn before I even moved. When the sun finally came up, I opened the door and stepped out with the axe. The air was cold. There were more boot prints, circling the cabin. I followed them a little ways into the trees, just far enough to see that they kept going. Then I went back inside, packed everything I could, and got ready to leave. The car wouldn't start. I tried 4 times. Nothing. Battery wasn't dead. Clicked like it wanted to turn over, but it just wouldn't catch. I popped the hood. I'm not a mechanic, but I checked the basics, battery cables, fluids. Nothing looked off, but the engine was dead, like something had been pulled or disconnected. I didn't know enough to fix it. No phone signal, no radio. I was stuck. That day was a blur. I kept trying the car. I started a fire and kept it burning, hoping maybe the smoke would be visible from the air. But I knew that was a long shot. This place wasn't near any flight paths. I'd chosen it because it was remote. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't even try. I I just sat there again, axe in my lap, waiting, listening. Nothing came. But in the morning, there was a piece of rope hanging from a tree about 10 feet from the porch. Bright yellow nylon rope like the kind people use for camping or hauling gear. It hadn't been there before. It was tied in a noose, swinging lightly in the breeze. Below it, in the dirt, were 2 fresh boot prints. That was the breaking point. I didn't care about the car anymore. I filled a backpack with water, food, and a flashlight and left on foot. I didn't follow the road. I was too afraid whoever was messing with me would be waiting there. I bushwhacked straight south, using the compass, hoping I'd hit a road eventually. I walked all day, barely stopping to drink, nerves stretched to the edge. It was almost dark when I found a dirt road. I didn't know where it went, but I followed it. I walked another few miles before I saw a pickup parked in a clearing. Nobody around. Keys in the ignition. I waited nearby, hiding in the trees, until a man came out of the woods with a shotgun slung over his shoulder. He looked surprised to see me, but not scared. I must have looked like hell, dirty, shaking, eyes wild. I told him I'd been staying at a cabin, that something wasn't right, that my car wouldn't start. He didn't ask many questions. He drove me to a small ranger station 20 miles away and waited with me until someone arrived. I gave a full report. Everything I saw, the boot prints, the rope, the sounds at night. They took it seriously. A few days later, I got a call saying someone had broken into another cabin a few miles away and stolen tools, food, and a pair of boots. They think whoever it was had been living rough in the woods all winter, maybe longer. They found my car. The starter wires had been cut. They never caught the guy. I don't go out there anymore. I don't camp alone. I sold the Subaru and got a truck with a CB radio. And every night, no matter where I am, I lock the door and double-check the windows. That noose in the tree still haunts me, because it wasn't meant for me. It was a message, a warning, and I listened. I didn't plan on going to the cabin alone. It was supposed to be a weekend with my cousin Mike, the same guy I grew up camping with in the summers, the one person I trusted more than anyone. He bailed on me the morning of the trip. Some emergency at work. I didn't even argue. I just loaded the truck and went anyway. I'd already blocked out the weekend, booked the place, and packed everything. Besides, I figured a little time away from people might do me some good. The cabin was up in northern Michigan, about 40 minutes from Grayling, tucked back in the woods off a dirt road that didn't have a name. I'd found it on an old rental site that didn't even have reviews. That probably should have been a red flag, but it was cheap, had running water, and I liked how remote it looked in the pictures. No neighbors in sight, which sounded perfect at the time. I got there around 3 in the afternoon. The sun was still high, but the trees were already starting to cast long shadows across the clearing. It wasn't a fancy cabin, just a small wooden structure with a pitched metal roof, a front porch, and one visible window. There was a narrow gravel path that led up to it from the main road, maybe a quarter-mile long, and it was barely wide enough for my truck to squeeze through. On either side of the path, thick forest. Pines mostly, but some birch and maples mixed in. It looked peaceful. Inside, the place was cleaner than I expected. One room with a twin bed, a small kitchen with a mini fridge and gas stove, and a little table with 2 chairs. The bathroom was a separate little closet-sized room with a toilet and sink. No shower. The water came from a well and the pressure was weak, but it worked. I dropped my backpack on the bed and unpacked slowly, letting myself settle into the silence. I spent the rest of the day walking around the property. Behind the cabin, there was a trail leading into the woods. It looked like an old deer trail, maybe used by hunters. I followed it for about half a mile until it broke into a small clearing, nothing but grass and low brush. I saw a couple of tree stumps with old axe marks and guessed someone used the spot for firewood at some point. There was no trash, no beer cans or bottles, nothing that suggested people had been out here recently. That was part of what made me uneasy. Even that first night, something felt a little off. It wasn't anything I could point to, just a sense that the woods were too quiet. I grew up near the forest, spent summers camping, and I know what a healthy forest sounds like. Wind in the trees, squirrels and chipmunks darting around, the occasional bird or rustling in the underbrush. But that night, after the sun went down, there was nothing, just stillness. I sat on the porch for a while with a beer in my hand, listening for any sign of life, but I didn't hear a single chirp. No crickets, no owls, no wind. I went inside, locked the door, and got into bed. I told myself it was just in my head, that maybe I wasn't used to this kind of silence anymore. But around 2 in the morning, I woke up. Not from a noise. I don't remember hearing anything specific, but I was suddenly wide awake, heart racing, like I'd been yanked out of sleep. I laid there staring at the ceiling, and after a few minutes, I realized the woods were still dead quiet. I couldn't sleep after that. I kept thinking I heard faint creaks or soft thuds outside, like footsteps on dirt or someone brushing against the side of the cabin. Every time I got up and looked out the window, there was nothing, just dark trees and shadows. I eventually dozed off close to sunrise, but it wasn't restful. The next day I felt off. Not sick, just foggy, like I hadn't really slept at all. I made coffee and ate a granola bar, then decided to clear my head with a walk. I went back to the trail I'd explored the day before and followed it further this time, pushing past the clearing and into denser woods. Maybe a mile in, I noticed something strange. A tree up ahead had what looked like deep gashes down its trunk. Not from animals. These were long, clean, vertical slashes, maybe from a blade. I walked closer and counted 4 of them, all in a neat row about shoulder height. I touched the bark, smooth where the wood had been exposed, like the cuts were fresh. I looked around and saw more trees with similar marks, all spaced about 20 or 30 feet apart, in a rough zigzag pattern through the woods. I followed the path of marked trees for maybe 10 minutes until I reached a spot where the forest floor had been disturbed. The dirt was loose, like someone had recently dug a hole and filled it back in. There was no mound, just a slight depression and some scattered rocks nearby. I crouched and pressed my palm against the dirt. It was cool, soft. Something had definitely been dug up or buried here. I don't know why, but it made my skin crawl. I stood up quickly, looked around, and suddenly felt like I was being watched. Not by an animal, by someone. I turned and headed back to the cabin, walking fast but trying not to run. The trees felt like they were closing in. Every shadow seemed darker than it should have been. I kept thinking I heard footsteps behind me, but every time I stopped to listen, it was dead silent. Back at the cabin, I locked the door again. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but I talked myself out of it. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe the tree marks were from hunters or surveyors, and the dirt could have been an animal digging. That's what I told myself. I spent the rest of the day reading and sitting inside. That night was worse. Around midnight, I heard the soft crunch of gravel outside. I froze. The gravel path was the only way to reach the cabin. I hadn't heard a car, and it wasn't windy. This was slow, deliberate movement. I turned off the lamp and sat on the floor behind the bed, where I could see the front window. I waited. After about 5 minutes, a figure moved past the window. Just a quick shape, tall, wide-shouldered, wearing dark clothes. No flashlight. No sound except for the crunch of their steps. They didn't knock, didn't try the door, just walked past slowly and disappeared into the woods. I stayed there all night, not moving, barely breathing. I didn't have a gun, only a small hatchet and a hunting knife in my backpack. I kept them both close. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because I woke up just after dawn to the sound of birds chirping. Finally, that morning I made my decision. I was leaving. I didn't care if I was being paranoid. I packed everything, shoved it into the truck, and didn't even stop to eat. The woods felt different again, but in a good way, like life had returned. Still, I wanted to be gone. I started down the gravel path. That's when I saw it, boot prints in the dirt, right next to the tire marks I'd left coming in. They were big too, maybe size 12 or 13, and they went all the way up to the cabin. I followed them with my eyes, and that's when I noticed the second set. Smaller, lighter, almost child-sized, but I hadn't seen a kid, just that one adult figure the night before. The smaller prints looked fresher, and they weren't there the day I arrived. They'd come in during the night and left before sunrise. I stood there a minute, staring at the tracks, trying to understand what that meant. Two people, one trying to stay hidden while the other distracted me? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. I just got in the truck and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I pulled into a gas station, went into the bathroom, and just stood there for a while trying to breathe. I felt dirty, not just sweaty or tired, filthy, like something had crawled under my skin and was still there. I didn't tell anyone about the trip for a few weeks. Not my cousin, not my girlfriend, not even my dad. When I finally did talk about it, I left most of the details out. I just said I felt uneasy out there, that I'd seen some weird stuff. That was enough for them. A few days after I got home, I checked the rental listing again. It was gone. The page was blank, no pictures, no contact info, nothing. Like the place had never existed. I tried emailing the guy who set it up, but the message bounced back. I thought about reporting it to the police, but what would I say? That I saw some footprints? That the woods were too quiet? That someone walked past my window but didn't do anything? They wouldn't care. They'd tell me to stop watching horror movies. So I let it go. But something still bothers me. That night, when the man walked past the window, I remember thinking how slowly he moved, like he was waiting for me to make a sound. And the more I think about it, the more I realize I never heard him leave. I watched the window for over an hour. I never saw him come back the way he came. He just disappeared into the trees, and I'll never know if he was alone. I still don't really know why I booked that cabin. It wasn't even a last-minute decision. I'd had the trip planned for about a month. I wanted a break from everything: work, traffic, emails, just people in general. I found the listing online. A small, one-bedroom cabin deep in the northern woods of Wisconsin. It wasn't part of a resort or community. It was just out there, about 3 hours from the nearest real town. The owner said it was perfect for solitude. At the time, that sounded great. The drive out was quiet. I left on a Thursday morning to avoid weekend traffic, packed up my car with groceries, gear, a few books, and basic supplies. The last 45 minutes of the drive were on a dirt road that hadn't been maintained much, so I took it slow. The trees got thicker, taller. There were no road signs, just one small hand-painted marker on a post that said Wells Trail, which matched the directions I got from the owner. I arrived in the late afternoon. The cabin was small but neat. Dark brown logs, pitched metal roof, tiny covered porch with 2 wooden chairs. It sat in a little clearing, surrounded by pines and hardwoods. I saw no other structures nearby. No cell signal either, which I expected. The owner had mentioned that in the listing, there was a landline for emergencies and a small portable generator out back, which I used just to power a few things in the cabin like the lights and fridge. No internet, no TV. That was fine by me. Inside, it was cozy. One main room with a bed, small wood stove, kitchenette, and a table by the window. The bathroom was just a little room off the back with a shower and composting toilet. Everything worked. There was a pile of split firewood stacked next to the stove and a few extra blankets in the closet. I settled in quickly. The first night was peaceful. I cooked a simple meal, read for a while, and listened to the wind in the trees. I fell asleep early and slept better than I had in months. The second day was more of the same. I hiked a few short trails near the cabin that the owner had mentioned in a little handwritten guidebook. I saw no one, just deer, birds, squirrels, and once way off in the distance what I thought was a black bear, but it was too far to be sure. I made it back before sunset, ate, read some more, and went to bed again, feeling even more relaxed. It wasn't until the third night that something felt off. I woke up around 2 a.m. for no real reason. There wasn't a sound or a dream that triggered it. I just opened my eyes and felt alert. The cabin was dark. I kept the generator off at night to save fuel and used a flashlight if I needed anything. I lay there for a minute, not moving, listening. Then I heard it, a crunch. It sounded like footsteps on the leaves outside. Just a few, not constant, and then nothing. I waited, ears straining. No other sounds followed. I told myself it could have been a deer or a raccoon. That was more likely than anything else. Still, I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and quietly made my way to the window by the table. I shined the light out, but all I saw were trees. I stood there for a while, scanning the clearing. No movement. Eventually, I went back to bed, but it took me over an hour to fall asleep again. The next morning, I went outside and walked the perimeter of the clearing. The ground was covered in leaves and pine needles, so spotting prints was tough. I thought I saw a few marks near the edge of the woods that could have been boot prints, but I couldn't be sure. They didn't go anywhere in particular. I chalked it up to me being overly alert. Maybe I had heard something, but it didn't mean someone was out there. Still, I felt different that day, a little unsettled. I kept my ears open more. Every creak or thump caught my attention. I even started locking the door when I was inside, which I hadn't bothered with before. It wasn't paranoia exactly, but I just couldn't shake the feeling that someone might have been out there that night. That evening, I didn't stay up reading. I turned the generator off earlier and lay in bed with the flashlight nearby. I didn't fall asleep right away. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, slower, deliberate. Footsteps, 2 or 3 steps, then silence. Then again off to the side of the cabin. Same pattern, like someone circling. I didn't move at first. I just lay there, heart racing. Then I sat up slowly and grabbed the flashlight. I didn't turn it on yet. I moved to the same window, knelt down and peeked out. Nothing. But then I heard a twig snap behind the cabin. I waited, heart pounding in my chest. I flipped on the flashlight and aimed it through the side window, sweeping the light across the edge of the trees. For a split second, I thought I saw something move between the trees. A shape just barely in the light before it was gone. Could have been an animal. Could have been a trick of the shadows. I stayed up the rest of the night, not moving from the chair by the window. Nothing else happened. At first light, I walked around the cabin again. I found more marks in the leaves. This time I was sure they were boot prints. Not fresh, but clear enough. They didn't lead to or from the dirt road. They came from the woods and stopped about 15 feet from the cabin. Someone had been out there. I packed a few things into my bag: water, snacks, flashlight, a knife, and a flare I kept in the emergency kit. I thought about leaving, but the road was rough and long, and there was no way to call anyone until I reached a town. Instead, I drove my car to the start of the dirt road, parked it facing out, and left the keys in my pocket, just in case. Back at the cabin, I felt exposed. I spent the day with my back to walls, checking the windows, listening. I kept the generator off. I didn't want to attract attention with lights or noise. I barely ate. The whole day was quiet, but my nerves were fried. Couldn't relax. As the sun dropped, I felt real fear for the first time. Not just worry, fear. The kind that makes your stomach tighten and your chest feel heavy. I didn't know what I was going to do if whoever was out there came back. That night, I didn't go to bed. I sat in the dark, by the window, flashlight in hand. No lights. I didn't even light a fire. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard footsteps again. This time, more than one set. At least 2. They came from the woods, slowly, spaced out. Then I heard something metal, like a chain or maybe a tool hitting a rock. It was faint, but it didn't sound like an animal. I stayed still, barely breathing. The sounds moved around the cabin, slow, steady, stopping and starting. Then something scraped the back wall. Just a second, enough to make my skin crawl. I didn't move for an hour. When the sun started to rise, I waited for more light, then ran outside and checked the back wall. There were scratches on the wood, like from a blade. Not deep, but obvious. Someone had dragged something sharp across it. I didn't go back inside. I got in my car and drove straight to the nearest gas station, 2 towns over. I used their phone to call the local sheriff. I told him everything. They sent a deputy out with me. When we got back to the cabin, we found more prints, multiple sets. The deputy didn't say much, but he looked concerned. He radioed it in. They found an old, tattered tent about a mile into the woods. Some clothes, empty cans, and what looked like a homemade spear. No people, just traces. I left that day and never went back. The owner of the cabin called me a week later. The sheriff's office had contacted him. He apologized, said nothing like that had ever happened before. He offered me a refund, even offered a free stay some other time. I declined. That trip changed the way I think about being alone in the woods. Not because of bears or weather or getting lost, but because sometimes people are out there too. People who don't want to be found. People who watch from the trees at night, who don't say a word, who walk in circles around your home while you sit inside, clutching a flashlight and hoping they go away. I don't camp alone anymore. I don't book remote cabins. I still hike, still go out into nature, but not like I used to. I've seen what's out there, and I'm not eager to see it again. I didn't plan to spend a week alone in a cabin. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway with a couple of old friends. We'd been talking about it for months. Just a break from everything. No phones, no work emails, no noise. Just the woods, a lake, maybe some beer and fishing. The kind of reset you think about when life's been too loud for too long. We'd found the place through a guy one of my buddies knew. It wasn't a rental listing or anything official like that. Just a cabin out by a small lake in the middle of nowhere, probably 4 hours out from anything you'd call a real town. According to the guy, it belonged to his uncle who didn't use it anymore, and we could have it for a week as long as we cleaned up after ourselves. It sounded perfect. Too perfect, in hindsight. Only one of the guys showed up the morning we were supposed to leave, Ryan. The others dropped out last minute. Family emergencies, work stuff, you name it. We debated calling it off, but the cabin was already arranged. Time off already taken. I told Ryan I was still going, and he said he'd think about it, maybe come out a day or two later. That was the last I heard from him until I got back. So I went alone. Took my truck, packed with supplies for a full week, non-perishables, bottled water, camping gear just in case, an old .22 rifle for small game or self-defense, and a bunch of random stuff like a flashlight, batteries, a first aid kit, and a few books. I left my phone on airplane mode. I didn't expect service out there anyway. The drive out was long but uneventful. 2 hours on paved roads, then another 2 through winding gravel paths that got narrower the farther I went. The last mile felt like it hadn't seen traffic in years. Trees hung over the road so thick that daylight barely got through, and I had to slow down to keep my tires from slipping into ruts. The cabin wasn't much, but it wasn't falling apart either. One level, a single room with a little kitchen area, a wood stove in the middle, and a bed against the far wall. A small bathroom had been added on at some point, with a composting toilet and a plastic tank for hand washing. Out back there was a woodshed, maybe 30 feet from the cabin, and a small dock that stretched out into a calm, dark lake. No other cabins or buildings in sight, just the forest and me. It was early afternoon when I arrived. I unloaded the truck, checked the place over, swept out some cobwebs. Everything looked fine. A bit dusty, a few spider webs, but no signs of animals inside or anything dangerous. There was no electricity, of course. Just an old propane stove and a single propane lantern. I got a fire going in the wood stove and cooked some canned soup. That night, I sat out on the dock with a flashlight and watched the stars come out. The first night was peaceful. I slept well. The quiet was unreal, like real silence that you just don't get anywhere else. I remember thinking I could actually feel my heartbeat in the quiet. That kind of silence. It made me feel small but calm. The second day, I did a little exploring. Hiked around the lake, didn't go too far from the cabin. Found some old trails, overgrown and barely there anymore. No footprints, no beer cans, no signs anyone had been out here in a long time. It was nice. I sat in the sun, read a bit, made coffee over the stove. That night, I watched the lake again, and the sky was so clear I saw a shooting star. The next morning, something felt different. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. Not the usual rustle of wind or the flap of a bird's wings. It was heavier, more deliberate. I lay there for a while, listening. It stopped before I could figure out what it was. I chalked it up to a deer or maybe a raccoon. Made breakfast, did some reading, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept glancing out the windows, just watching the tree line. Something about the stillness felt wrong. I told myself I was just getting in my own head, being jumpy because I was alone. That was probably true. but I still kept the rifle closer to me after that. That night, I didn't sleep as well. I kept waking up. Little sounds outside. Cracks. Snaps. Once I thought I heard breathing just outside the cabin wall. Not loud, just soft and steady, like someone was standing inches from the wall. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and held the rifle in both hands. I didn't move for over an hour, just sat there in the dark, waiting. Eventually, I got up and walked quietly to the front door. I pressed my ear against the wood. Nothing. I opened it a crack and looked outside. Just trees, just dark, but my skin was crawling. I closed it again and locked it. I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. I didn't expect to find anything, and I didn't, really. But I did see some things that got my attention. Small things. A patch of moss that had been scraped off a rock, like something heavy had stepped on it. A broken twig at chest height. A strip of bark peeled off a tree in a long vertical tear. Things that could mean nothing. Or not. That night, I put a chair under the doorknob and kept the rifle on my chest while I lay in bed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw shapes in the dark. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the fear didn't care. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, careful, one step at a time. My chest went cold. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The steps stopped in front of the door. I waited for a knock, or for the doorknob to turn, but nothing happened. The steps just stopped. Then, slowly, I heard them again, this time moving away across the porch, then fading into the distance. I sat there with the rifle in my lap until morning. When the sun came up, I opened the door and looked around. No footprints. The ground was too hard, mostly dry pine needles and dirt, but I knew what I'd heard. I considered leaving. I should have. I knew that, but I told myself I was being crazy, overreacting, letting the isolation mess with my head. I thought maybe it was a bear, maybe even a person passing through, hunting or hiking, not realizing anyone was staying in the cabin. The truck was parked behind the cabin, not visible from the front. Maybe they didn't know someone was inside. I spent most of that day inside, just reading, checking the windows. I started thinking about how far I was from help. No cell service, no neighbors, no one expecting me back for several days. If something happened out here, no one would know. That night, I stayed up with the lamp on. Every hour, I looked out the window, slowly, quietly. Around midnight, I saw movement. Someone was standing at the edge of the woods. They weren't moving, just standing there. Not close, but close enough that I could see the outline of a body. Arms at their sides, still as a tree. I turned off the lantern. I stayed by the window for hours. Every few minutes, I looked again. The shape was still there, but by 4 a.m., it was gone. The next morning, I made up my mind to leave. I packed everything fast. I didn't eat. I didn't even clean up. I just grabbed my bags, loaded the truck, and locked the cabin behind me. As I got into the truck, I felt eyes on me. I don't know why. I didn't see anyone, but the skin on my neck tightened like something was watching. I started the truck, backed it down the narrow trail until I hit the gravel road. I drove fast, probably too fast, but I didn't care. Every minute I was still near those woods felt wrong. It took almost an hour to get back to the main road. Once I hit pavement, I felt myself start to breathe again. I looked in the rearview mirror more times than I want to admit. Every tree I passed felt like it was hiding someone. I got home that evening. I didn't unpack. I went straight to bed, slept with the lights on. The next morning, I turned my phone back on. Dozens of texts, missed calls. Ryan had tried to reach me, so had others. I called Ryan back. He asked if I was okay. I said yes, just tired. He asked if I'd seen the news. I hadn't. There had been a manhunt near the area I'd been in. A suspect had escaped custody in a small town about 20 miles from the cabin. Last seen heading into the woods. Armed, dangerous, desperate. They'd found his campsite 2 days after I left. It was less than half a mile from the cabin. The only thing they found missing was a knife. I never told anyone the full story. Not about the steps, not about the figure in the woods, not about the breathing outside the wall. But I've never gone back to the woods alone, and I never will. I never really liked the idea of cabins in the woods. Something about them always felt off to me. Maybe it's the isolation or the silence that seems too quiet, like it's hiding something. But that fall, I ignored my gut. I needed the break. I'd been working 12-hour shifts for months straight, barely sleeping, eating garbage, and snapping at people for no reason. My blood pressure was high, my back was killing me, and even my doctor told me to take time off before I burned out completely. So when my buddy offered me his uncle's old hunting cabin for a week, I said yes before even asking the details. He told me it was up near the edge of the state forest, a good 4-hour drive from the city, and about 10 miles from the nearest town. No neighbors, no cell service, no internet. Just a small 2-room wooden structure, stocked with firewood, canned food, and a generator that supposedly still worked. He even told me there was a little lake nearby where I could fish or just sit and relax. It sounded perfect. I could read, sleep, go for long walks, maybe write a little. That's what I told myself, at least. The drive up was peaceful. The further I got from the city, the more the tension in my chest seemed to ease. The leaves had already started turning, and the road into the woods was lined with oranges, reds, and yellows. It felt like something out of a painting. By the time I got to the turnoff for the dirt road that led to the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sky was soft and gray, the air a little cool, and the road looked barely touched. I drove slow, avoiding deep ruts and rocks, until the trees opened up and the cabin came into view. It was older than I expected. The wood was dark and weathered, the roof sagging a little in the middle. There was a small porch with a couple of broken chairs and a stack of firewood to the left of the door. A tin chimney poked out from the roof, and the windows were dusty but intact. I parked my car on a patch of grass to the side and got out, stretching my legs and taking a deep breath. The air was clean. It smelled like pine needles, wet leaves, and something sharp I couldn't place. I told myself it was just the forest. Inside, the cabin was simple. One main room with a couch, a small table, a fireplace, and a kitchenette. Off to the side was a bedroom with a full-size bed, a nightstand, and a single small window that looked out over the trees. There was a trapdoor in the floor of the kitchen, which I found out led to a root cellar stocked with canned food, bottled water, and some old tools. I was surprised by how well stocked it was. Someone had really taken care of it. I spent the first evening just settling in. I lit a fire, unpacked my stuff, made a sandwich, and opened a book. There was no signal on my phone, so I turned it off and left it on the nightstand. By the time it got dark, I was already starting to feel the kind of tired you only get after a long, stressful stretch of work. I turned in early that night and slept harder than I had in months. The next couple of days were calm. I hiked through the woods, sat by the lake, and read for hours. I wrote a few journal entries, ate simple meals, and went to bed early. The silence was strange at first, almost too quiet, but eventually I got used to it. The only sounds at night were the wind through the trees, the creaking of the cabin settling, and the occasional hoot of an owl or rustling of leaves outside. I felt like I was finally unwinding, but things started to feel different around the third night. It was about midnight when I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why at first. There hadn't been a sound, not that I could remember, but my heart was racing, and my skin felt cold, even though the fire in the other room was still burning low. I lay there for a while, trying to slow my breathing, telling myself it was just the change in routine or maybe a dream I couldn't remember. Then I heard it. It wasn't loud, just a soft crunch outside, like a footstep on dry leaves. Then another, then silence. I held my breath and stared at the ceiling. I listened for anything else, an animal, a branch falling, something that would make sense. But there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing and the fire popping in the next room. I told myself it was probably a deer, or maybe a raccoon, something harmless. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. I didn't see anything strange, no footprints, no signs of animals, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods didn't feel the same. It was like the silence had changed. Before, it had felt peaceful. Now it felt heavy, like it was watching me. That day, I went further out on the trail, hoping some movement and distance would clear my head. I hiked for a couple of hours, found a ridge with a good view, sat for a while, and then made my way back. When I got to the cabin, the front door was closed. I always locked it when I left. Always. But the lock was hanging open. I stood there for a long minute, just staring at it. I hadn't told anyone I was here. I hadn't seen a single person since I'd arrived. There were no other cars, no voices, nothing. My mind raced. Was someone here while I was gone? Was someone still here? I slowly opened the door and stepped inside. The place looked the same. Nothing seemed touched. My bag was where I left it, the blanket still messy on the bed, dishes still in the sink. But it felt different, like someone had been inside. I checked every corner, even the cellar. Nothing. That night, I pushed a chair under the doorknob and kept the fire low. I didn't sleep much. Every little creak made me sit up. I heard noises again around midnight. Soft steps like before. This time they circled the cabin. I stayed in bed, frozen, staring at the ceiling again. My hand was clenched around the flashlight I'd brought with me, even though I wasn't sure what good it would do. The steps paused outside the bedroom window. Then nothing, just silence. When the sun came up, I looked again. No tracks, no signs, but something told me I wasn't imagining it. I started thinking about leaving. I packed some of my things, kept them by the door, and spent the day inside. I didn't feel safe hiking anymore. That evening, I didn't light the fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I ate a cold dinner and stayed quiet. As it got darker, I heard something again. This time, it was softer, a scraping sound near the back wall. I moved slowly to the kitchen, heart pounding, and grabbed a heavy cast iron pan from the stove. I crouched near the door, listening. It stopped. I waited for what felt like hours. Eventually, I crept back to bed, pan still in hand, and stayed awake until morning. The next day, I made up my mind to leave. I couldn't stay another night. I packed everything, made sure the car was ready, and checked the road to make sure nothing had blocked it. It was clear. I planned to leave at first light, but that night something changed. I was lying in bed, half-dressed, when I heard the doorknob jiggle. Not once, not by the wind, but like someone was testing it. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My heart felt like it was going to break my ribs. Then came a knock. 1, 2, 3. Slow, deliberate. No voice, no footsteps after. Just the knock. I stayed like that until dawn. I didn't sleep at all. As soon as it was light, I grabbed my bag, locked the door behind me, and got in my car. I didn't even eat. I just left. The drive back was quiet. I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing, just trees and road. When I finally got back to the city, I told my buddy his uncle's cabin wasn't for me. I didn't explain. I didn't want to. I just said thanks and left it at that. It's been months since that trip, and I still don't know what happened. Maybe it was a squatter. Maybe some hunter passing through. Maybe someone who knew that cabin was usually empty and didn't expect anyone to be there. But what bothers me isn't the noises or the knocks. It's that feeling I had, like I wasn't alone. Like someone had been watching me from the second I got there. Like someone had keys, knew when I was out, knew when I was sleeping, knew I was alone. I changed after that trip. I lock every door twice. I don't go out to remote places anymore. And I sure as hell don't sleep in old cabins in the woods. Because sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. Sometimes it's just people. Quiet people, patient people, people who wait and watch and know you're all alone. I rented a cabin in the woods for a week because I needed to get away from everything. My work had been draining me for years. Sitting in front of a screen for 12 hours a day, answering emails, fixing other people's mistakes, chasing deadlines that never really seemed to mean anything. I wasn't sleeping well, I wasn't eating right, and my mind just felt constantly loud. I needed quiet. I needed to be alone for a little while. So when I saw a listing for a secluded cabin about 4 hours outside the city, surrounded by trees, no Wi-Fi, no cell signal, I booked it immediately. The pictures showed a small wooden place with a porch, a wood stove, and 1 bedroom. There was a little kitchen with the basics and a tiny bathroom with a shower and toilet. It was buried in the woods, a few miles off a narrow county road. The listing mentioned there were a couple other cabins scattered around the area, but not close enough to see or hear. That was perfect. I wanted space. I didn't want to bump into anyone. I didn't even want to see another person. I drove up on a Sunday afternoon in late October. It was still warm enough during the day, but the nights had started to get cold. I had packed some warm clothes, extra blankets, a pile of groceries, and a few old paperbacks I'd been meaning to read for years. I also brought my hatchet, a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a couple of tools just in case. I wasn't planning on doing anything dangerous, but you never know when something simple can break out there. The road to the cabin turned off a small 2-lane highway onto a dirt road that twisted through thick forest. The GPS gave up about 10 minutes before I got to the turnoff, and from there it was just following a printed map that the owner had emailed me. There were a couple of hand-painted signs nailed to trees that helped. I passed one other cabin off the road, maybe a mile before mine. It was quiet, and I didn't see anyone outside. After that, the trees got thicker, the road narrower, and finally, I came around a bend and saw the little wooden cabin sitting up on a rise, surrounded by bare trees with piles of dry leaves all around it. It looked even more isolated than the pictures had shown. There was no driveway, just a clearing where I could park, and the only sounds were the wind in the trees and a few birds. I stood there for a while before unloading the car, just breathing. It really was quiet. No hum of traffic, no voices, no phones buzzing, just stillness. Felt good. The cabin itself was small but solid. It had a front porch with 2 old wooden chairs and a railing that had seen better days. The door creaked when I pushed it open, but everything inside was clean and smelled like cedar. There was a little sitting area with a couch and a table, a small kitchen with a propane stove, and the bedroom in back had a queen-sized bed with a thick wool blanket on it. Everything was old but looked well cared for. I unpacked slowly, storing the food, setting up my sleeping stuff, and putting the books on the little shelf by the bed. The owner had left a few notes: how to use the stove, where the firewood was stacked outside, and a reminder to make sure the propane was turned off before I left. There was a battery-powered radio, but I turned it off after trying it once and only getting static. I didn't want noise. I wanted to clear my head. The first couple of days went by like a dream. I got up with the sun, made coffee, and sat on the porch for hours doing nothing. I went for slow walks down the trail behind the cabin, crunching through the leaves, watching squirrels dart between trees, and listening to the wind rustle the last dry leaves. I read for hours. I napped. I cooked simple meals, eggs, soup, sandwiches. I had no plans, no schedule. For the first time in years, I actually felt my brain slowing down. The anxiety that had clung to me like static started to fade. I felt like myself again. But by the 3rd night, something started to feel off. Started small. I was sitting by the wood stove just before bed, reading, when I thought I heard something outside. A soft scraping, maybe, not loud, just enough to make me stop and listen. I turned off the little lamp and sat in the dark, waiting, but I didn't hear anything else. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or something moving around outside. There was a lot of wildlife out there. That was normal. The next morning, I found what looked like a boot print in the dirt behind the cabin. It wasn't fresh. It could have been a couple days old, but it didn't match my boots. It was narrower and longer. I stood next to it, lined up my foot with it, and the heel was completely different from mine. Pointed toward the woods, not the trail, just off behind the outhouse where I hadn't walked since I got there. I stared at it for a long time. Again, I told myself it could have been from a hiker. Maybe someone had passed through before I got there. Maybe one of the other cabin owners had walked around. But it bothered me. It didn't feel right. I kept checking the trees that day, looking between them, listening. There was nothing. No voices, no footsteps, nothing. That night, it got worse. I went to bed around 10. The stove was burning low, and I had layered blankets over myself since it was cold. I slept hard, like I had the past 2 nights, but something woke me up at some point. I don't know what time it was. I didn't have a clock in the bedroom. I just remember opening my eyes in the dark and feeling that pressure in my chest. That heavy silence where you know something isn't right. I stayed still, listening. I thought maybe I had dreamed it, but then I heard it. Something brushing against the wall. Not scratching, more like a slow drag, like something rubbing against the wooden siding. It moved from one side of the cabin to the other, maybe 5 or 6 feet from where I was laying. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just lay there, frozen, trying to make sense of it. Then it stopped. I waited maybe 10 minutes, then 20, then slowly reached for the flashlight I kept by the bed and turned it on. The room lit up, and nothing looked out of place. I got out of bed, quietly, and crept into the living room. The cabin was still. The fire had burned down low. I didn't hear anything outside. I sat there until the sky started to lighten outside. When the sun finally came up, I went out and looked around the cabin. I didn't find anything. No tracks, no marks on the wall. But I knew what I had heard. I thought about packing up that morning. I really did. I even put some of my stuff back in the bag. But I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. I hadn't seen anything. Could have been wind. Could have been an animal. I had 2 nights left. I'd driven all the way out here. I didn't want to run back over a noise, so I stayed. That day, I didn't go for a walk. I stayed near the cabin, chopping some extra wood, keeping the fire going, keeping busy. I found myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, looking at the trees. I didn't read. I didn't relax. I didn't feel like myself anymore. That night, I went to bed with my clothes on. I kept the flashlight next to me, along with the knife. I left the fire burning hotter than usual. I must have dozed off because I didn't hear the first sound. But I woke up suddenly, and this time I was sure something was on the porch. I could hear the boards creaking, slow and careful, like someone trying not to make noise. Then a soft knock. Not loud, just 3 soft taps on the wooden door. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just stared into the darkness, heart pounding so hard it felt like it would shake the bed. Another knock, then silence. I don't know how long I lay there, probably hours. I waited for the sun again. I didn't sleep after that. When it was light, I opened the door. There were faint scuff marks on the porch, like the toes of boots dragging slightly, but no deep prints. I couldn't tell where they'd gone. I looked around the trees. Nothing. That was it for me. I packed everything as fast as I could, barely ate breakfast, and threw my bags in the car. I didn't clean up. I didn't care. I just wanted to be gone. On the way down the road, I saw a figure off to the side. It was just a shape between the trees, a good 100 yards off the road, standing completely still. I slowed the car, staring at it, and realized it was a man. He was wearing a brown jacket and jeans. His face was pale. He wasn't moving, just watching. I didn't stop. I didn't wave. I pressed the gas and kept driving. I made it to the highway in maybe half the time it took me to get in. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone behind me. There never was. I didn't relax until I was back in cell range and could call a friend just to hear a voice. I didn't even tell them what had happened. I just said I was heading home early and needed to crash at their place that night. I didn't report it. I didn't call the cabin owner. I left a review that said, "Nice place, very quiet," and nothing else. I didn't want to deal with questions. I just wanted to forget, but I couldn't. For weeks afterward, I kept seeing that shape in my dreams, that still figure by the trees, those soft knocks on the door. And the worst part was knowing it wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was a person, a real person. Someone was out there watching the cabin, walking around it at night, knocking on the door in the dark. And I still don't know why. Maybe they just liked. I had been needing a break from everything for a while. Work was piling up. My phone never seemed to stop buzzing. And even when I got home, I couldn't shut my mind off. My apartment in the city was a box, and the noise outside always made it hard to breathe. I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere completely cut off. I remembered a coworker telling me about a small off-the-grid cabin up in the northern part of the state. No electricity, no internet, and barely any cell signal. That was exactly what I needed. I got the number of the owner, an older guy who rented it out occasionally, and booked it for a week. It was a 4-hour drive from the city. I packed up a cooler, some dry goods, a flashlight, a few books, and drove up on a Thursday morning. The last hour of the drive was a narrow road through thick trees and hills. No houses, no signs, just the crunch of gravel under my tires and the occasional deer darting off the side of the road. My GPS dropped out about 10 miles from the turnoff. I followed a paper map the owner had emailed me before, a hand-drawn route with little markers like split rock and old fence. Felt old school, but I liked that. I finally pulled up to the cabin just after noon. It was smaller than I thought it would be. Just a simple square structure with a covered porch and a metal chimney poking up from the roof. The wood was old and weathered but solid. There were 2 windows in the front and a heavy wooden door. A small trail led down behind the cabin into thicker woods. The trees were tall and close together, and the air smelled sharp with pine and moss. I stepped out of the car, stretched, and just stood there for a minute listening. No traffic, no voices, no hum of electricity, just wind moving through trees and the ticking of my cooling engine. Inside, the cabin was basic. 1 room with a wood stove in the corner, a small kitchen area with a propane burner, and a cot on one side with a thick mattress. There was a small table with a couple of chairs and a shelf with old paperbacks, most of them swollen from humidity. The bathroom was outside, a compost toilet in a separate wooden shack about 20 yards away. There was a hand pump well beside it for water. It was rough living, but that was the point. I put my cooler in the kitchen area, set my pack on the cot, and lit the stove with a match. Took a little coaxing, but the fire caught. I spent the first afternoon settling in. I swept out some dead bugs from the corners and opened the windows to air the place out. I walked down the trail behind the cabin for a while, not going too far. It wound down a hill and then split into a few directions. There were no signs, so I stuck to the main path. I came across a small stream where I washed my face and hands. The water was cold and clear. When I got back to the cabin, the sun was getting low, and the trees cast long shadows across the clearing. I made some soup on the burner, read a little from a book I'd brought, and turned in early. That night was quiet except for the occasional sound of branches tapping against the roof and a distant owl. I slept hard and woke up a little disoriented around 6 in the morning. It was cold. I had to restart the fire and wait for the stove to warm the place up. I made some coffee on the burner, sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, and just watched the woods. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in years. I spent that day hiking a bit farther. I packed a small bag with water and snacks and followed the main trail past the stream. The forest was dense but not hard to navigate. The ground was soft with pine needles, and I saw some deer tracks and heard a woodpecker somewhere off to the left. About 2 miles in, I found an old hunting stand up in a tree. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. I climbed up and sat for a while, eating a granola bar and just listening. Still no sign of people. That was fine by me. I got back around 4 in the afternoon. The sun set early behind the hills, so I got the stove going again and made some pasta. It was a little lonely without anyone to talk to, but it was better than the stress of back home. I tried calling my sister just to check in, but there was no signal. I sent her a text that said, "All good, no service out here," but it didn't go through. I figured it would send once I was back in range. That night, things started to feel different. It was around midnight when I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire was out, and the cabin was cold. I got up to throw a log on the stove and noticed the door wasn't fully closed. Just a crack, but enough that the wind was making it creak. I was sure I had shut it. I got a little paranoid, thinking maybe I didn't latch it all the way. I closed it, slid the bolt across, and sat by the stove until it warmed up again. I didn't go back to sleep for a while. The next morning, I looked around outside just to reassure myself. There were no tracks that I could see, just the same patchy snow and pine needles. I told myself the wind probably pushed the door open. It was old and didn't seal well. Still, I kept checking behind me every so often as I hiked that day. I didn't go far. That evening, as I was sitting on the porch drinking some tea, I thought I saw something move between the trees. Just a quick flicker of movement off to the left near the trail. I stood up, staring, but saw nothing. It might have been an animal, a raccoon or a deer. I waited a long time, but nothing came out. I told myself it was nothing, but I stayed inside after that. I didn't even read. I just sat at the table listening. That night, I locked the door and slid a chair under the handle. I fell asleep with the flashlight in my hand. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I heard something on the porch. Not the wind, not a branch. It was weight, footsteps, slow, deliberate. One step, then nothing, then another. The boards creaked. My heart started pounding. I sat up in the dark, listening. I didn't move. I didn't turn on the light. I just waited. The steps moved across the porch and stopped near the door. Then silence. I didn't breathe. I counted to 60 in my head. Still nothing. Then I heard the handle move. Just a click, like someone was testing it. The bolt held, and the chair didn't move. I waited. After a while, the steps moved again. Back across the porch. Down the steps. Then gone. I sat there until the sun came up. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. As soon as it was light enough to see, I opened the door slowly and stepped out. The ground was undisturbed. No clear footprints. The porch looked the same, but something was different. My cooler, which I had left on the porch, was tipped over. The lid was off and some of the food was gone. It hadn't been an animal. The lid was unlatched. There were drag marks in the dirt where something had been pulled toward the woods. I packed my bag. I didn't want to stay another night, but when I got in the car and tried to start it, nothing happened. Turned over once, then died. I checked the battery connections, tried again, but it was dead. The dashboard lights flickered, then nothing. The nearest town was 20 miles back. I had no signal. I was stuck. I tried to stay calm. I told myself I'd hike out in the morning. It was too late in the day to make it before dark, and I didn't want to be caught halfway in the woods after sunset. I gathered my stuff, filled my pack with what I needed, and left the rest behind. I locked the cabin, even though it felt pointless now, and sat on the floor with my back against the door. That night, it came back. I didn't sleep. Around 1 in the morning, I heard the steps again. Slower this time, one at a time, across the porch. They stopped in front of the door. I could hear breathing, not loud but steady. Close. Then the door handle moved again, more forceful this time. The bolt held, but the door creaked. Then I heard something that made my blood go cold. A sound, a slow dragging sound, metal on wood, like something being pulled, scraped. I didn't want to imagine what it was. I stayed like that for hours, just sitting, heart pounding, hand on the flashlight. When the sun finally came up, the sounds were gone. I opened the door. There was a knife stuck in the wooden post beside the door. A long, rusted hunting knife, stabbed deep into the beam. I didn't touch it. I didn't want my prints on it. I grabbed my pack, locked the cabin again for whatever reason, and started walking. I hiked fast, barely stopping. I followed the trail past the stream, up through the ridges, and didn't look back. I had a compass, and I knew which direction the road was. After about 3 hours, I saw the split rock from the map. I knew I was close. I kept going. I got to the gravel road around noon and flagged down a passing truck about half an hour later. It was a local guy, older, who didn't ask many questions. He drove me into town. I used the phone at the gas station to call a tow truck for my car and booked a room at a motel. I didn't go back to the cabin. I gave the owner a vague story about car trouble and not feeling well and left it at that. When I finally got home, I changed my number. I didn't tell anyone the full story. I kept it to myself for a long time, but I still think about it sometimes. The footsteps, the cooler, the knife, whatever or whoever it was, they knew. I never liked staying in other people's cabins. I always felt like I was intruding, even if I had permission. It's just that weird feeling of being around someone else's furniture, someone else's bed, their smells, their old food left behind in the pantry, their stuff tucked away in drawers. Still, when my coworker Ken offered me his family's old cabin for the weekend, free of charge, I said yes. I was overdue for a break. I hadn't taken a proper day off in months. Between work and everything else going on in my life, I was running on fumes. Ken had talked about the cabin a few times before, how it sat right on a ridge above a small lake, surrounded by nothing but trees and quiet. No phone service, no Wi-Fi. That sounded like exactly what I needed. So I took a Friday off, packed up some supplies, and headed up there. It was early October. The leaves were mostly down, but some colors still clung to the higher branches. The air was cooler than I expected. I wore just a flannel shirt when I left home, but by the time I hit the last dirt road that led up to the ridge, I had to turn the heat on in the car. The road was barely more than 2 tire tracks through the trees, and I had to drive slowly to avoid scraping the bottom of my car on rocks. I passed a rusted gate Ken said would be unlocked. It was. Then, after another couple of turns, I saw the roof of the cabin appear through the trees. It was smaller than I imagined, more like a glorified shed with a deck, but it looked solid, not run down. I parked beside it, got out, stretched, and immediately noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just that thick, empty silence you only get deep in the woods. I unlocked the front door using the key Ken had given me and stepped inside. It smelled like cedar, dust, and old blankets. The cabin had one main room with a couch, a stone fireplace, and a small kitchen in the corner. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. Everything was basic but clean enough. Ken had warned me there was no running water this time of year. The pipes were shut off to prevent freezing, but there was a big blue jug of water on the kitchen counter and an outhouse out back. I carried in my bag a couple of groceries and a cooler with beer and sandwich stuff. I started a fire in the little wood stove and sat on the couch as it warmed up. I had a paperback novel with me but couldn't concentrate on reading. My mind just sort of wandered. I didn't feel anxious, but I didn't feel relaxed either. I guess I needed time to adjust to the change of pace. That night, I cooked a can of chili on the stove and ate it straight from the pot with a spoon. I sat outside on the deck for a bit, listening to the night. Still no wind, just dead calm. I could see a slice of the lake through the trees, black and still. A few bats flitted above me. I smoked a cigarette and went back inside. There wasn't a TV or anything to distract me, so I went to bed early. I used my phone as a flashlight to find my way down the hallway, then turned it off and laid down under a heavy wool blanket. I must have dozed off quickly because I don't remember lying there long. But I woke up around 2:30 a.m. to a noise. Not loud, just soft movement outside. I figured it was an animal, maybe a raccoon. I listened a while longer and didn't hear anything else, so I went back to sleep. The next morning, I walked around the outside of the cabin, half looking for prints in the dirt, half just stretching my legs. Nothing unusual. I sat on the deck again with a cup of instant coffee, just looking at the trees, watching mist curl off the lake. I still hadn't seen a single person since I'd arrived. Later, I went down to the water. There was an old canoe flipped upside down near the shore, and a broken dock that extended about 10 feet before falling apart. The lake was small but deep-looking. Cold, too, I could tell just by looking at it. I sat on a log and tossed pebbles into the water. Time moved differently up there. It felt like the middle of nowhere, like nothing was really happening in the world beyond those woods. I thought I'd be bored, but I wasn't. I just kind of drifted. That night was colder. I kept the fire going longer and bundled up more before going to bed. Again, I fell asleep pretty quickly, but woke up sometime after midnight. This time the sound was closer. There was a soft crunching, like footsteps on leaves. Very slow, very careful. I sat up in bed and held my breath. The sound stopped. I got up and tiptoed to the window. I didn't turn on a light. I just peeked out through the corner of the curtain. I couldn't see anything. The trees stood still and the moon gave off just enough light to cast faint shadows. I watched for a full minute. Nothing moved. Eventually, I laid back down. My heart wasn't racing or anything, but I felt unsettled. It didn't feel like an animal. Animals don't move that carefully. It sounded like someone trying not to be heard, but that made no sense. I was miles from anyone. There were no other cabins nearby, no trails, no reason for anyone to be out there. I told myself it was just my brain messing with me. I fell asleep again after a while, but the feeling lingered. The next day, I decided to explore a bit further from the cabin. I followed the ridge north, where the trees thinned out and I could see more of the lake below. I found an old trail, mostly overgrown, and followed it about half a mile until it just faded into brush. The ground was soft with pine needles and damp earth. I saw a few squirrels, nothing else. On the way back, I noticed something that made me stop. Off to the side of the trail was a tree with its bark scraped off, maybe 3 feet up from the base. It looked fresh. The wood underneath was pale and exposed, and the edges of the bark were curled like something had been peeled away. I stepped closer and saw a few faint scratches running vertically up the trunk. At first, I thought it might be a bear marking, but bears usually claw higher, and the spacing was weird, too narrow. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had done it. Maybe with a knife. For what purpose, I had no clue. I backed away and walked quicker the rest of the way to the cabin. That evening, I kept checking the windows. I couldn't stop thinking about that tree, about how the scraping looked deliberate. The more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. I skipped dinner and had a couple beers instead, trying to shake the unease. I kept the fire going but dimmed the lanterns early. I didn't want to cast bright light out the windows. At some point after 10 p.m., I heard the sound again, the same careful crunching of leaves. This time, it came from the backside of the cabin, closer. Then a pause, then another step. My body went still. I didn't go to the window this time. I stayed seated on the couch, barely breathing. The fire in the stove had gone low, and the only light in the room came from the dim coals. I strained to hear more. There was a long silence, then a quick shuffling noise, like someone brushing against the wooden siding. I stayed frozen for a long time after that, maybe 30 minutes. Eventually, I moved to the floor, away from the windows, and waited until I couldn't hear anything at all. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found footprints, human footprints, in the soft dirt behind the cabin under the trees. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked back there. They were spaced far apart, as if someone was moving slowly, heel to toe, trying to be quiet. I could see the treads of a worn boot, not recent but not ancient either, maybe made in the last couple days. I stood there staring at them for a while, realizing I had no way to prove anything. No phone service to call for help. No real emergency to report. Just some footsteps, some noises. Nothing had happened, but something was off. I could feel it. That afternoon, I packed my stuff. Not everything, just the essentials. I locked the cabin and hiked to the highest spot on the ridge where I managed to get a single bar of signal. I texted my brother, just a short message. Cabin feels off. Coming back tomorrow. All good. I didn't want to seem paranoid. I didn't want him worrying. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I stayed dressed with my flashlight and knife beside me on the couch. I turned off every light and waited. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard the door handle move. Not a knock, not pounding, just a gentle rattle like someone testing it. I didn't move. I just listened. The sound stopped. Then I heard faint footsteps on the deck. Then nothing. I waited until sunrise before I moved again. When it got light, I went outside and looked around. More footprints on the deck. Same tread, same pattern. I got in my car, drove straight down the ridge without stopping, and didn't look back. I didn't tell Ken anything beyond thanks again. It was peaceful. I never went back. A week later, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I called the sheriff's office for that county and asked if there had been any reports of trespassing or strange activity near the ridge. They said no, nothing out of the ordinary, but something was wrong up there. I don't know if someone was watching the cabin, or living nearby, or just passing through and found it empty. I don't know what they wanted, but they didn't try to break in. They just watched, waited, moved quietly. I I booked the cabin in early fall, mostly because it was cheap. I found it online on a rental site that had hundreds of listings, and this one was buried deep in the pages. It wasn't flashy, and the pictures weren't great. Just a few grainy shots of a dark wooden building surrounded by trees. But it had good reviews, and it was only about 4 hours from where I lived, tucked up in the northern part of the state near a lake. I thought it would be a good place to get away for a few days, clear my head, maybe do some riding and hiking. The drive up was long and winding. I remember the last 2 hours were nothing but back roads and pine trees. No gas stations, no stores, barely any signs. I lost cell service about 30 minutes out. That was something I should have thought more about, but at the time it just felt like part of the experience. I wanted peace and quiet, no distractions, just nature and me. When I finally pulled into the clearing where the cabin sat, I was tired and stiff from driving, but I was relieved it actually existed. I had half worried I'd arrive to find nothing but a patch of dirt. The cabin was smaller than I expected. The logs were dark with age, the roof was steep and covered in damp-looking shingles, and the front porch sagged a little in the middle. There was a tiny gravel area for parking, barely big enough for my car, and a narrow dirt path that led around the side of the cabin into the woods. Trees pressed close on every side, and even though it was only around 3 p.m., the light was already fading under the thick canopy. Everything smelled like wet leaves and bark. I let myself in with the key that had been left in a rusted lockbox on the porch. The inside was plain, just one big room with a kitchen in one corner, a couch, a little dining table, and a wood stove in the center. There was a short hallway that led to a small bedroom and a bathroom with a cracked mirror and old plumbing. The floors creaked with every step. The place felt cold and a little damp, but not in a gross way. More like the kind of damp you get in old buildings that have been shut up for a while. I unpacked, lit a fire in the stove, and made some coffee with the old machine in the kitchen. That first night was quiet. I read a little, then sat on the porch with my coffee, listening to the woods. It was dead silent, not even the sound of bugs or birds. I told myself it was because fall had come early and the animals were already moving on. I stayed out until the sun dipped completely behind the trees, and the cold started creeping in. Then I went inside, locked the door, and turned in early. The second day started off fine. I woke up to sunlight barely slipping through the trees and made a basic breakfast, eggs and toast on the old gas stove. I decided to hike down to the lake that was supposed to be about a mile from the cabin. There wasn't a clear trail, but I followed a worn-looking path that curved through the trees. The forest was dense and quiet. It was hard to tell how far I'd gone, and I kept thinking I heard footsteps behind me, but every time I stopped and turned, there was nothing. I reached the lake after maybe 40 minutes. It was small and still, with brownish water and a thick tree line wrapping around it. No boats, no cabins, no signs of people. I sat on a rock near the edge for a while, ate a granola bar, and skipped a few stones. Then I headed back. I stayed on the path, but somehow it felt different going the other direction. I came across a small clearing I didn't remember seeing on the way down. In the middle of it, there was a large rock with a rusty tin can sitting on top. That stopped me. It was out of place. No campsite, no fire pit, nothing else around. Just the rock, the can, and silence. I didn't touch it. I just walked past it, faster than before, and didn't stop until I saw the cabin again. Back at the cabin, something felt off. Couldn't place it. The door was still locked and everything looked the same inside, but the air was colder. I kept thinking about that tin can and the weird silence in the woods. I chalked it up to nerves and being alone. I made lunch, then tried to read, but I kept checking the windows. There were no curtains, just bare glass, and I hated how much forest was visible from every angle. Like anything could be out there, just watching. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside. It was soft, like something brushing against the wall. Then it stopped. I laid there, eyes open in the dark, waiting for it again. 10 minutes later, it came back, this time on the opposite side of the cabin. A dragging sound. I didn't move. I just stayed under the covers, heart pounding. Eventually, it went quiet again. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up, it was morning. The third day, I didn't leave the cabin. I felt uneasy, like something wasn't right. I kept hearing things. Faint snaps, like twigs breaking, or rustling in the underbrush. I told myself it was animals. Deer, maybe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. At one point, I looked out the front window and saw what looked like a mark in the dirt, like something had been dragged near the edge of the trees. It wasn't big, but it hadn't been there before. Later, I walked around the cabin just to check things. On the back wall, about 2 feet off the ground, I saw a scratch mark. 3 lines, uneven and deep enough to dig into the wood. Too high for a raccoon or something like that. I took a photo of it on my phone, even though I still had no signal. Then I went back inside, locked the door, and shoved one of the chairs under the knob. That night was worse. I barely slept. The noises came back. More dragging, soft thuds, something like breathing near the bedroom window. But when I looked, I couldn't see anything in the dark. Just trees. At one point, I thought I saw a shape standing near the edge of the forest, but it was too dark and far away to be sure. I sat up for hours, clutching the flashlight I'd found in the kitchen drawer. In the morning, I found footprints outside. Bare footprints. No shoes. Just human-shaped prints in the soft dirt, circling the cabin. I counted at least 10 of them, some close to the walls, others near the path into the woods. No pattern, no direction, just there. I stood there for a while, staring at them. My skin felt cold. I didn't know what to do. I decided to leave. I packed everything in 20 minutes, locked the place up, and got in my car. But when I turned the key, the engine didn't start. Nothing, not even a click. I popped the hood, looked inside like I knew what I was doing, and saw that the battery cables had been pulled off. Not just loosened, ripped out. The ends were frayed. I slammed the hood shut and stood there, heart racing. Someone had done that during the night. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to figure out what to do. No phone signal, no landline. The nearest place I'd seen on the drive-in was at least 10 miles back, maybe more. I didn't want to walk that far, especially with someone or something out there watching me. I spent most of the day sitting in the main room with the fire going, listening. Every now and then, I'd hear a branch crack or something moving just outside the windows, but I never saw anything clear. Around dusk, I made a decision. I wasn't going to stay another night. I packed what I could in my backpack, took the flashlight, a kitchen knife, and started walking. I stuck to the dirt road I'd come in on. It was narrow, and the trees were thick on both sides. I moved fast, not running, but not strolling either. I kept hearing things behind me. Footsteps, snapping twigs, but I never looked back. I just kept moving. After maybe an hour, I heard a noise off to my right. Heavy footsteps in the underbrush. Then a voice. Just a single word, my name. Quiet, almost casual. I stopped cold. It was the first sound I'd heard that wasn't nature. A man's voice, deep and rough. I didn't call back. I didn't move. I just stood there, shaking. Then I ran. Full speed. I don't know how far. I just ran until my legs burned and my chest felt like it was going to explode. Eventually, I saw lights, faint but real. A house at the end of a gravel driveway. I sprinted to the porch and pounded on the door. An older man opened it, looking confused, and I just blurted out that I needed help, that my car was dead, and someone was out there. He brought me inside, gave me water, and let me use his phone. I called a tow service, then the local sheriff. The tow truck came 2 hours later, followed by a deputy in an old SUV. I told them everything about the noises, the footprints, the car battery. They didn't say much. The deputy said they'd check it out in the morning. The tow driver dropped me and the car at a small motel in the nearest town. I stayed in that motel for 2 nights. On the second day, the deputy called me. He said they went out to the cabin, didn't find anyone. But the back door was open, and there were muddy footprints inside. No signs of forced entry. He said it was probably a vagrant or hunter passing through. Nothing they could do. I didn't go back for the rest of my stuff. I canceled the rental and left a review saying the cabin wasn't secure. I never heard from the owner. I still don't know who was out there or why they singled me out. But I know this. Someone knew I was there. Someone watched me. I had rented a small cabin in the Smoky Mountains for 5 days. It was a solo trip. I needed a break. Life had gotten noisy, busy, all tangled up in stress from work and people. I hadn't been alone in years. I'd been working the same job, day in and day out, and everything felt like it was closing in around me. This trip was supposed to be a reset. The cabin was a basic rental I found online. It was described as rustic, sitting deep in the woods with no Wi-Fi, no TV, just a small propane heater, running water, and a shortwave radio. I liked the idea. I wanted quiet. I wanted nothing. It took almost 8 hours to drive out there from home. I remember the last 2 hours were nothing but winding 2-lane roads through heavy woods. No towns, no gas stations, no signs of other people. I saw deer on the side of the road. Twice I had to slow down to let them pass. The road was narrow and full of sharp turns, and I started to feel how far out I was going. It was early October, and the leaves were thick on the ground, hiding holes and roots in the dirt driveway that led to the cabin. When I finally got there, I had to get out and move 2 fallen branches just to finish the drive up. The cabin was smaller than it looked in the pictures. It was old wood, dark brown, 1 little porch, and a metal roof that looked like it had seen better decades. There was a small shed next to it, a fire pit out back, and what looked like an old hiking trail leading down the slope into the trees. There were no other houses, no distant rooftops, no sounds except for birds and leaves shifting in the breeze. I unpacked slowly. There wasn't much. I had my backpack, a duffel bag with clothes, a cooler full of food and drinks, some bottled water, a flashlight, a knife, and a first aid kit. The cabin had a small bed with a faded flannel blanket, a wooden table, a couple chairs, a counter with a pump sink that ran off a holding tank, and a little stove that used a propane tank outside. It smelled old, not dirty, just aged, like the way a library smells but mixed with wood smoke and dry leaves. There was no cell service. I tried, walked around the cabin, held my phone up. Nothing. I didn't expect it, but it still hit a little harder when I realized I was completely disconnected. No internet, no way to call anyone. If something happened, I'd be walking hours to find a road. But that was the whole point. Disappear for a few days, clear my head. The first day passed quietly. I cooked a can of chili on the stove, went for a short walk down the trail behind the cabin, and came back before sunset. I didn't want to get lost. The woods were thick, old trees, roots everywhere, rocks covered in moss. I didn't hear much wildlife. A few birds, some rustling, but no larger animals. I saw scat on the trail, probably deer, maybe a bear. I had bear spray in my pack just in case. I kept the cabin locked at night. The front door had a big bolt, and the windows were small and high up. That night it rained, lightly at first, then harder after midnight. The sound on the metal roof was steady, almost calming. I slept all right. Woke up once because I thought I heard something outside, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. But I told myself it was a branch or the wind and went back to sleep. The second day, I went farther down the trail. It sloped downhill for about a mile, then leveled out near a creek. The water was cold and clear. I filled a bottle, used purification tablets, and sat on a rock for a while, just watching the trees move. I kept hearing things in the woods. Not loud things, just little snaps and crunches in the distance. I stayed alert. I wasn't scared, just cautious. It's different when you're really alone. Every sound stands out more. When I got back to the cabin, I found the front door open. Stopped me cold. I knew I locked it. I remembered sliding the bolt before I left. The wind couldn't have done it. It wasn't broken or damaged, just hanging open like someone had gone in or come out. I didn't move for almost a full minute. I just stood there in the leaves, staring at the door, trying to process. My first thought was that I'd forgotten. Maybe I didn't lock it. Maybe I thought I did and just pulled it shut. But I remembered the sound of the bolt sliding into place. I approached carefully, stayed to the side of the door frame, peeked inside through the open door. Nothing looked disturbed. My pack was on the bed where I left it. My cooler was still on the table. Nothing was overturned or missing. I stepped in, checked the whole cabin. There wasn't much to check. One room, tiny closet, little bathroom with a composting toilet. Nothing. No one. Still, it felt wrong. I locked the door again, double-checked it, then wedged a chair under the knob. I kept the flashlight and the knife next to the bed that night. I didn't sleep much. I heard more noises outside, but I couldn't tell what they were. Could have been raccoons. Could have been wind. Could have been something else. The third day, I barely left the cabin. I walked out to the fire pit, looked around, and stayed close. I kept thinking about the door. I kept trying to convince myself I forgot to lock it. I didn't want to get paranoid, but something about the silence around the cabin was starting to bother me. I realized I hadn't seen another person in 3 days. No hikers, no campers, not even a plane overhead. Just nothing. Around noon, I found tracks. They weren't boot prints. They were bare feet. Human, but not big. Smaller than mine. Could have been a teenager or a small adult. The weird part was how fresh they were. They were in the damp dirt just past the edge of the trees behind the cabin. The heel marks were clear, toes splayed. One track, then another. Walking, not running. Just passing by, maybe 30 feet behind the cabin. My stomach tightened. I followed them for maybe 20 yards before they vanished into the underbrush. I didn't want to go farther. It felt like following them would be inviting something. I went back to the cabin and locked the door again. It was still only early afternoon, but I shut the curtains and turned on the propane heater. It was getting cold anyway. I sat at the table and listened. I didn't hear anything. I stayed up most of that night. I dozed for maybe an hour at a time, then woke up to check the door, the windows. I thought I heard someone walking around the cabin just after midnight. Slow steps, deliberate, not animal movement. Leaves crunching in a steady rhythm, once every few seconds. They circled the cabin. I didn't move. I just sat on the bed in the dark, holding the knife, listening to my own breathing. My mouth was dry. I didn't even think about using the flashlight. I didn't want whoever was out there to see me. The steps stopped on the porch. No knock, no sound, just silence. I waited. Maybe 20 minutes passed. Then the steps started again, back down the steps, around the side of the cabin, and away into the trees. I stayed frozen in place until sunrise. I didn't care how much time I had left on the rental. I started packing right after daylight. I loaded up my cooler, threw everything in the duffel, and walked the cabin twice to make sure I wasn't leaving anything behind. I didn't hear anything that morning. No more steps, no strange sounds, but the woods felt heavier, like something was watching. I could feel it in the back of my neck. That weird electric feeling like your body knows something before your brain does. When I stepped out onto the porch, I noticed something sitting on the steps. It was a dead squirrel. It had been gutted, cut open down the belly with something sharp. Its insides were pulled out but not eaten, just laid out neatly on a flat rock like a display. The body was clean, no blood sprayed around, like someone took their time. I gagged, turned away, and forced myself to breathe. I didn't touch it. I didn't move it. I just walked past, threw my bags in the car, and left. I didn't look back. The drive out felt twice as long. I kept checking the rear view, expecting to see someone behind me on the road. No one came. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station nearly an hour away. When I got there, I sat in the car for 10 minutes before going inside. My hands were shaking. I still didn't have signal, but I was closer to town. I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't tell anyone right away. I didn't know what to say. Someone left a gutted animal on my porch? Sounded like a bad horror movie. I didn't want to sound crazy. I just went home, unpacked, and tried to forget it. But for days after, I kept checking my windows. I kept waking up in the middle of the night, thinking I heard footsteps outside. I stopped going into the woods. Even local parks made me nervous. A few weeks later, I decided to call the company that rented out the cabin. I didn't expect much. I just wanted to say something, warn them. I gave them the cabin's name and the dates I stayed, and the woman on the phone went quiet for a second, then asked me to repeat it. Then she told me that property hadn't been listed on their site for over a year. They stopped renting it out after someone broke in and trashed it last fall. It wasn't even supposed to be active. She asked me where I booked it, and I gave her the website. Turns out,